My intermission guest for concert night is pianist Richard Dowling, whose performance of the Moszkowski Piano Concerto from 18 years ago. You just heard. Richard, it's great to see you. You look like you've aged about 18 days, so you'll have to give me your secret.
Oh, well, COVID provided us all with opportunities to do things we wouldn't probably otherwise get to do, like exercise. So there's one pro tip.
Right. And good living. So let me start off, first of all, by apologizing that it's been 18 years since we last had you here in Dayton. We'll try to fix that in the incoming seasons and bring you back, because I loved playing with you, and the orchestra loved playing with you, and the audience loved hearing you play. Can you tell us a little bit just about, by this time we've been 2 years through this craziness and hopefully coming out the other side. What's your professional reemergence been?
It's been a tough 2 years, of course, for every musician on the planet. Nobody could have foreseen everything just coming to a grinding halt. I had a friend, a pianist friend of mine. She was in tears saying, "My career is over." I said, nobody's getting ahead during this. Everybody's got a fermata over their heads. A fermata, it means hold. Everybody's just frozen. So I don't know. I spent 2 years practicing, reviewing old repertoire, looking at new repertoire, and just really thinking about music. It was great. It was like being back in music school again, music conservatory, where you've got hours and hours to practice and fritter away and just think about music and read and do all kinds of things. And so, I've got some projects I'd like to do. But concerts are finally starting slowly to come back. I think it's going to take a couple of years for things to get back to normal in our musical life, but I think there's a glimmer of hope there. And the few concerts I've done in the last year or so have given me a renewed sense of appreciation for live music making. As great as recordings are, and that's what we're listening to right now, there's nothing going to beat the live experience. And I think that's why people go to concerts of all genres, because they like a communal experience. You get goosebumps when you listen to great music. I'm not saying you can't get that on a recording, but it's harder to pull off. The live, being chock-a-block in a hall, listening together, there's nothing like it.
You're absolutely right. And I know, and you know too, but our audience really, they've heard it, but they need to hear it over and over again, how much they mean to us. And just how, back when we were just playing in an empty hall to cameras that were recording for streaming, it was great to be playing again. But knowing that there was nobody you could actually sense out there, as soon as even when we had just 50 or 100 people in the hall at the very beginning, it made such a difference. And now that the audiences are really starting to look very encouraging, it's just so exciting to have that energy back and that sort of magical sense of the connection between the audience and the performer.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, do you notice a difference between the quality of that energy when you're a recitalist, a single person at the piano and an audience listening to you, versus when you're a concerto soloist? Is it any different, or is it just the same thing but different because of the type of music?
It's completely different. Both have their pros and cons. Most piano recitals, unless you're super duper famous, are not in 2,000 seat halls.
Right.
They're in 300, maybe even 200 seat halls, 500 seat halls. And I always ask the stage managers to leave the house lights on at about 50%, because I talk during my concerts, and I tell a little funny anecdotes and stuff, not in a dry, boring, musicological way. I tell great little stories and dad jokes and all kinds of stuff and make people laugh. And people always say, "God, you're as much an entertainer as you are a musician." And so when I can see the audience, because the lights are at half mast, it feels like I've just invited people over to my living room and we're having a great time together, just a musical party. Whereas when you play in a big hall like the Schuster Center and the lights are down and the spotlights, super bright spotlights are in your eyes, and you walk out on stage and stare into blankness, you know that it's the same folks out there, just more of them, but it's intimidating. And but by the same token, when you hear 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people applaud, wow, what an experience that is. That's the payoff for those nerves. And I don't like to say I'm nervous when I play. I usually try to talk myself into saying I'm anxious to play.
So that's interesting what you said about the house lights. So I'm wondering if say you're playing a concerto, if the house lights during the concerto performance were at 50% instead of out all the way, would you feel more comfortable, or would you feel like it was a distraction having them there?
No, it would make me so much more comfortable.
That is so, I never thought of that. The next time we have as we're speaking, we'll have our next piano soloist, actually no, our first piano soloist, because what we did this season is we put our piano soloist all the way towards the end of the season in case we were still under space limitations at the beginning of the season. So we could, take advantage, and hopefully, thankfully, everything is better now than it was then. And we're basically back to full strength. But so we're about to have our first piano soloist, and I will ask her, would you like to have the house lights up a little bit? And I'll mention that I was talking to Richard, and he said he's always more comfortable that way. And someone else may say, "Oh God, no! I don't want to see them. I just want to focus on my Rachmaninoff." But I never thought of that. So thank you for that tip. Let's talk a little bit about the Moszkowski Concerto that our audience just heard. The piano has this vast repertoire of concertos, but even so, we tend to hear, we hear Tchaikovsky, we hear the Rachmaninoff concertos, the Beethoven concertos, Mozart, Grieg, Schumann sometimes, Clara Schumann once in a blue moon. It's mostly familiar names that we hear. So when an audience comes to a concert and sees a name they don't know, I think there's always a little bit of, oh gosh, what's this going to sound like? Is this going to be one of those concertos? And then they hear it and it's like, where have you been all my life? We have a fun situation coming up next season. Janina Filkovska is coming back to Dayton. And actually we were in an interview just like this, maybe a year and a half ago. And I said, I'd love to have you, we'll have this question later in our discussion. I'd love to have you back to play with the Philharmonic. What would you like to play? And she said, I would love to play the Paderewski Concerto.
Oh.
And I said, really? And she said, yes, you have to listen to it. It's the best concerto you never heard. And I listened to it later that same day, and I emailed her right back and said, you're absolutely right. So tell us a little bit about, what was it about the Moszkowski that intrigued you, that made you want to suggest it, and just some thoughts about the piece.
Well, it was dedicated to the great pianist Joseph Hoffman, who was, even though small in stature, he was big in technique, and he was the dominant pianist at the turn of the century. That's 100 years ago.
The other century.
The other century. In the 1920s, he was one of the top dogs in the piano world. And he was my teacher's teacher. I got to study with Abby Simon. Mr. Simon just died a couple of years ago at 99 and 11/12. And he was a student of Joseph Hoffman at the Curtis Institute. Mr. Hoffman handpicked him to come to Philadelphia from New York at age 8. And Mr. Simon said, getting to study with someone like Joseph Hoffman at age 8 was truly an overwhelming experience. I brought the Moszkowski to Mr. Simon for a couple of lessons when I was preparing to play it with the Dayton Philharmonic. And he said, what are you doing playing my teacher's concerto? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, nobody played that concerto except Joseph Hoffman through the 1920s, 30s, 10s, 20s, and 30s until Hoffman died. He owned that piece. Nobody else dared touch it. Very few people could play it. I mean, it's a really mammoth work, you know, sort of equal helpings of Saint-Saëns and Rachmaninoff with great tunes. But that piece belonged to him. And I guess after he died, since everybody had stayed away from it, it sort of died with Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Simon was thrilled to hear it again. He said, I remember hearing him practice that over and over and over when I was a little boy studying at Curtis. And he said, I got to accompany him, play the orchestra part later in my life when I was a little older, and I could play the orchestra part, which is very difficult. And in fact, when Moszkowski composed this piece at the very end of the 19th century, like 1898 or 1899, I believe at some point there was like some famous pupil of Franz Liszt, I can't remember now, who did a performance with Moszkowski of it on two pianos. Moszkowski himself was a terrific pianist. I think you'd have to be a first-rate pianist to be able to write something with so many notes. Anyway, it was really, really tough to learn something that was not already in your ear. And when you grow up, you mentioned all the famous piano concertos, you know, from being a little boy, I heard the Tchaikovsky Concerto a million times. So if I were to pick that up and relearn it, I already know how it goes. The Moszkowski, even though it's a very tuneful piece, to get it in the inside of your head where you know, well, what's coming next? It takes a long time when you haven't had a lifetime to digest it, hear other people play it, listen to a million recordings. So it took me 6 to 9 months to prepare it to perform in Dayton. And it was a lot of work, but man, those concerts were terrific. I'll never forget them.
They were great fun, and it's so nice to rehear and re-experience the concert after all these years. I'm wondering, so we're sort of getting your lineage. So you studied with Abby Simon, who studied with Joseph Hoffman. If you go back beyond Joseph Hoffman, who do you get to? Do you know?
I don't know, but I do know that Moszkowski studied with Saint-Saëns. And that's, I think there's, you know, an obvious link there. Moszkowski was Polish and German. I mean, the borders then at the end of the 19th century were very fluid, of course. But he spent most of his professional life in Berlin and in Paris. So he was sort of equal helpings of Polish, German, and French. And he had a lot of pupils himself. And I think he learned a great deal from the composers of his day, specifically Saint-Saëns. Being in Paris and hearing that kind of work, his music has a lot of French in it, even if he's a quote German composer. It's got everything. I mean, and the orchestra is not like a Chopin orchestra. The orchestra has great tunes. It's a full symphony orchestra with all the stuff. I mean, you can tell them what's involved. I'm sure you couldn't perform that work with fewer than, say, 60 people. I mean, you'd need
it's
a full symphony orchestra to do it. It's the height of Romanticism.
And it needs rehearsing too, because the orchestra part is no slouch. Yeah. So Moszkowski is a rather unknown composer to most casual listeners, certainly. So are there other composers like that whose music you love to play but are not household names who you think we should know about? Oh, Gottschalk, yes.
And Joplin. Yeah. See, besides doing the straight classical stuff, you know, I specialize also in 19th century American music, up through ragtime and early jazz of the 20s and 30s through Gershwin. And so one of my new projects during COVID is to learn a lot of Gottschalk. I'd already been playing his music for years and years, but I literally have every edition book of Gottschalk that there is available that I've found online, and photocopies and all kinds of stuff. libraries have he wrote something like 8 or 9 CDs worth of music. That's a lot. I mean, that's like on a Chopin scale, and he and Chopin only lived to age 39. They both, had very short lives, but were very prolific. Now, Gottschalk only wrote really one piece for piano and orchestra. That's his Grand Tarantella, and it's a terrific piece. But it's only like 8. It's only 8 minutes.
Yeah,
but audiences really like it. And there's a solo version and a 2 piano version that I play with my duo piano partner. And let me tell you, audiences really love the Grand Tarantella. It's like a cherry on top of an ice cream sundae. And his music has got everything of Chopin and Liszt, all the glitz of Liszt, but with a big dose of American flavor. And when I include his music on my recital programs, people will say, "I've never heard of that composer. Who is he? Is that an English composer?" Nope, American from the Civil War. He was super famous. I mean, he played a piece called The Union, composed a piece called The Union. Even though he's from New Orleans, he came down on the side of the North and played it for President and Mrs. Lincoln in Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow.
And Lincoln stood up in his box seat and took off his stovepipe hat and bowed to Gottschalk as a thank you for his rah-rah support of the North in the Civil War. And so he was very, very well known in his day. He was the first American musician to go on tour by train and stagecoach, often hauling around 1 or even sometimes 2 of his Chickering concert grand pianos with him on the trains and on stagecoach, because he was super rich, super famous, and left, sort of illegitimate children in his wake, everywhere he went.
The Genghis Khan of 19th century American piano.
Right. You can't really tell the difference between Moszkowski and Gottschalk if you look at photographs of them. They both have these enormous 19th century bushy mustaches. That was the fashion. And they look like dastardly villains, in a cartoon.
Snidely Whiplash.
Exactly.
Oh, that's great. So let me ask you that big question. When we have you back to play with the Dayton Philharmonic, what would your choice of return piece to play be? Anything you like? Oh,
no, you're not supposed to. You're the music director, Neal.
Yeah, but
you're the one that plans the programs.
You're the guest.
Oh, no. I'll play anything you want, anything that fits into your programs. Whether I know it or not, I'll learn it. I'll be happy to relearn it. There's so much great music out there. That was the terrific thing about getting to play the Moszkowski. I mean, I doubt I'll ever get to play it again. Conductors, generally have, their seasons all set out way in advance, and things have to fit in just right. And the Moszkowski is a super long concerto, 4 long movements. It takes up a big chunk of the meal. So whereas the Gottschalk, I mean, that could almost be like a little encore piece, So I don't know if we did a Mozart concerto or something, maybe we could throw the Gottschalk Grand Tarantella in and wallop people over the head.
That would be fun. Speaking of, and I'm not, I mean, it could be, but I'm not necessarily suggesting this, but on the subject of lighter music or music, we play so many of the serious concertos.
Right.
And you were just talking about Gottschalk and Joplin and composers who wrote music that's lighter and that's fun and that's different. Just recently, one of our musicians turned me on to, maybe you know this piece, maybe you don't, turned me on to Concerto for Myself by Friedrich Gulda.
Oh, no, I've never heard of that.
This is a piece, well, Friedrich Gulda, we played a piece of his on the show recently, a concerto that he wrote for cello and basically kind of not quite big band, but kind of a little bit like the Cantina band in Star Wars, just a very, very cool sound. And our associate concertmaster, this was many years ago, but he did an arrangement of the piece for violin instead of cello, and he played it on an electric violin, and it just knocked the house. Everybody loved it. And Aurelian, the violinist, was telling me he has this piano concerto called Concerto for Myself. And Gulda was, I don't know if you know him, he was into jazz. And so it sometimes sounds like Beethoven, and sometimes it sounds like Chick Corea. And there's drum set and there's stand-up bass, and it just breaks down all of those walls of serious music, and it's just delightful.
Yeah.
And you hear a piece like that and you think, it's wonderful to do these serious concerts and, high art,
Right.
we are the grand priests of this lofty art form. But sometimes it's nice to play stuff that's just fun. So it's wonderful that you, in your choice of repertoire, sort of play both sides of that divide and make it so it isn't a divide.
I'm proclaiming that 2022 is a Beethoven do-over. So at the end of my recitals, I play Furlies, and then just before the last chord, I launch into a ragtime stride boogie version of it. And of course, they have to have ambulances lined up outside the recital hall for all the classical music aficionados who are having heart attacks. And then the rest of the normal people in the audience are going like, yeah, I love that. That's great. That's my favorite song. It's the song that there were never any words to. But in any case, that's what I like to do, is take a classical piece and play it totally legit, straight. And then just before the end, show that you can take that coin and flip it over to the other side and see all of the American popular syncopation, jazz chords, if you want to call them, the harmonic language of American popular music that has literally taken over the world in the last 120 years, and show that those two things are not only not incompatible, but really just the same thing in a different way. And it's no disrespect to Beethoven or any other composer that I might do that to. It's just my showing off and also my showing that you can have fun, not that classical music doesn't have to be stuffy, that you can have, foie gras, but you can also just have country pate. Both are tasty. We don't have to be so, like you say, high art with a capital H and a capital A. We can have fun too, on stage. And I like to make the audience laugh. I'm a serious musician, but if I'm having a good time, my nerves go down, they're relaxed, they have a good time, they want to come back and buy tickets and attend more concerts. And so it's just a big circle of happiness and satisfaction.
Amen to that. So, Richard, I look forward to having you back in Dayton, and we'll have some fun together.
Great.
And no matter how serious the main piece will be, we'll talk about, maybe we'll squeeze that Gottschalk Grand Tarantella in as an encore and hit him right between the eyes.
Good.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Good to see you.